centurions which he was to convey to Rome. He began to speak of the soldier's discharge after 16 years, of the rewards of completed service, of the daily pay being a denarius, and of the veterans not being detained under a standard. When Drusus pleaded in answer reference to the Senate and to his father, he was interrupted by a tumultuous shout. Why had he come? Neither to increase the soldiers' pay, nor to alleviate their hardships; in a word, with no power better than their lot? Heaven knew that they were all allowed to scourge and execute. Tiberius used formerly in the name of Augustus to frustrate the wishes of the legions, and the same tricks are now revived by Drusus. Was it only sons who were to visit them? Certainly it was a new thing for the emperor to refer to the Senate merely what concerned the soldiers' interests. Was then the same Senate to be consulted whenever notice was given of an execution or of a battle? Were their rewards to be at the discretion of absolute rulers, their punishment to be without appeal? At last they deserted the general's tribunal, and to any praetorian soldier or friend of Caesar's who met them, they used those threatening gestures which are the cause of strife and the beginning of a conflict, with special rage against Cnaeus Lentulus, because they thought that he above all others, by his age and warlike renown, encouraged Drusus, and was the first to scorn such blots on military discipline. Soon after, as he was leaving with Drusus to betake himself in foresight of his danger to the winter camp, they surrounded him and asked him again and again whither he was going. Was it to the emperor or to the Senate? There also to oppose the interests of the legions. At the same time they menaced him savagely and flung stones. And now, bleeding from a blow and feeling destruction certain, he was rescued by the hurried arrival of the throng which had accompanied Drusus. That terrible night which threatened an explosion of crime was tranquillized by a mere accident. Suddenly in a clear sky the moon's radiance seemed to die away. This the soldiers in their ignorance of the cause regarded as an omen of their condition, comparing the failure of her light to their own efforts, and imagining that their attempts would end prosperously should her brightness and splendor be restored to the goddess. And so they raised a din with brazen instruments and the combined notes of trumpets and horns, with joy or sorrow, as she brightened or grew dark. When the clouds arose and obstructed their sight, it was thought she was buried in the gloom, and that proneness to superstition, which steals over minds once thoroughly cowed, they lamented that this was a portent of never-ending hardship, and that heaven frowned on their deeds. Drusus, thinking that he ought to avail himself of this change in their temper, and turn what chance it offered to a wise account, ordered the tents to be visited. Clemens the centurion was summoned with all others who for their good qualities were liked by the common soldiers. These men made their way among the patrols, sentries, and guards of the camp gates, suggesting hope or holding out threats. How long will you besiege the emperor's son? Was there to be no end of our strifes? Will Pernicius and Vibulenus give pay to the soldiers and land to those who have earned their discharge? In a word, are they, instead of the Neros and the Drusi, to control the empire of the Roman people? Why are we not rather first in our repentance, as we were last in the offense? Demands made in common are granted slowly. A separate favor you may deserve and receive at the same moment. With minds affected by these words, and growing mutually suspicious, they divided off the new troops from the old, and one legion from another. And then by degrees the instinct of obedience returned. They quitted the gates, and restored to their places the standards which, at the beginning of the mutiny, they had grouped into one spot. At daybreak Drusus called them to an assembly, and though not a practised speaker, yet with natural dignity upbraided them for their past and commended their present behavior. He was not, he said, to be conquered by terror or by threats. Were he to see them inclining to submission and hear the language of entreaty, he would write to his father that he might be merciful and receive the legion's petition. At their prayer Blysus and Lucius Apronius, a Roman knight on Drusus's staff, with Justus Catonius, a first-rank centurion, were again sent to Tiberius. This ensued a conflict of opinion among them, some maintaining that it was best to await the envoy's return, and meanwhile humor the soldiers, others that stronger measures ought to be used, insomuch as the rabble knows no mean, and inspires fear, unless they are afraid, though when they have once been overawed, they can be safely despised. While superstition still swayed them, the general should apply terror by removing the leaders of the mutiny. Drusus's temper was inclined to harsh measures. He summoned Vubulenus and Perkinius, and ordered them to be put to death. The common account is that they were buried in the general's tent, although according to some their bodies were flung outside the entrenchments for all to see. Search was then made for the chief mutineers. Some as they roamed outside the camp were cut down by the centurions, or by the soldiers of the praetorian cohorts. Some even the companies gave up in proof of their loyalty. The men's troubles were increased by an early winter with continuous storms so violent that they could not go beyond their tents, or meet together, or keep their standards in their places, from which they were perpetually torn by hurricane and rain. And there still lingered the dread of the divine wrath. Nor was it without meaning, they thought, that, hostile to an impious host, the stars grew dim and storms burst over them. Their only relief from misery was to quit an ill-omened and polluted camp, and having purged themselves of their guilt, to betake themselves again every one to his winter quarters. First the 8th, then the 15th legion returned. The 9th cried again and again that they ought to wait for the letter from Tiberius, but soon finding themselves isolated by the departures of the rest, they voluntarily forestalled their inevitable fate. Drusus, without awaiting the envoy's return, as for the present all was quiet, went back to Rome. About the same time, from the same causes, the legions of Germany rose in mutiny, with a fury proportioned to their greater numbers, in the confident hope that Germanicus Caesar would not be able to endure another supremacy, and offer himself to the legions, whose strength would carry everything before it. There were two armies on the bank of the Rhine. That named the upper army had Gaius Silius for general; the lower was under the charge of Aulus Caecina. The supreme direction rested with Germanicus, then busily employed in conducting the assessment of Gaul. The troops under the command of Silius, with minds yet in suspense, watched the issue of mutiny elsewhere; but the soldiers of the lower army fell into a frenzy, which had its beginning in the men of the 21st and 5th legions, and into which the 1st and 20th were also drawn. For they were all quartered in the same summer camp in the territory of the Ubii, enjoying ease or having only light duties. Accordingly, on hearing of the death of Augustus, a rabble of city slaves who had been enlisted under a recent levy at Rome, habituated to laxity and impatient of hardship, filled the ignorant minds of the other soldiers with notions that the time had come when the veteran might demand a timely discharge, the young more liberal pay, all an end of their miseries, and vengeance on the cruelty of the centurions. It was not one alone who spoke thus, as did Perkinius among the legions of Pannonia, nor was it in the ears of trembling soldiers who looked with apprehension to other and mightier armies, but there was sedition in many a face and voice. The Roman world, they said, was in their hand; their victories aggrandized the state; it was from them that emperors received their titles. Nor did their commander check them. Indeed, the blind rage of so many had robbed him of his resolution. In a sudden frenzy they rushed with drawn swords on the centurions, the immemorable object of the soldiers' resentment, and the first cause of savage fury. They threw them to the earth and beat them sorely, 60 to 1, so as to correspond with the number of centurions. Then, tearing them from the ground, mangled and some lifeless, they flung them outside the entrenchments or into the river Rhine. One Septimius, who fled to the tribunal and was grovelling at Caecina's feet, was persistently demanded till he was given up to destruction. Cassius Chaerea, who won for himself a memory with posterity by the murder of Gaius Caesar, being then a youth of high spirit, cleared a passage with his sword through the armed and opposing throng. Neither tribune nor camp prefect maintained authority any longer. Patrols, sentries, and whatever else the needs of the time required, were distributed by the men themselves. To those who could guess the temper of soldiers with some penetration, the strongest symptom.